Let me just say I'm the member of the Shadow Cabinet commissioned by Jeremy to work on constitutional matters and on preparing Labour for government. We're thinking very hard about what we will do in the first few hours, the first few days, the first 100 days and so on of an incoming Labour government. It's my job to prepare that work. I'll speak reflecting what I think the framework is, but also say some of the matters which Labour has already resolved and indicate other issues which remain to be discussed further. So let me just begin by saying that our country stands at a major crossroads, as we all know. Look at our ancient institutions. So many of them now in decay, with so little sense of purpose or direction. A British establishment clearly uncertain whether our economic future or their economic future lies with Europe, with the United States, with Trump, or with some other form of global alignment. And the nation outside of the British ruling class has lost faith in that class, but as yet we haven't persuaded them that there's another way forward. And when countries enter into prolonged crises like this, and we can see it throughout our history and through the history of other countries, events become extremely erratic and unpredictable. That's what we now are. If you look at history carefully, one possibility is clearly that in a situation of historic stalemate, that a single dominant figure begins to emerge, offering to build a new country, a new Britain, a British Bonaparte. Boris Johnson thinks it's him. He is basically an instrument of a failed elite project. And therefore he cannot and will not deliver a new progressive set of arrangements, which is what the country is crying out for. And so it's up to us. Because I said it in my opening remark, we haven't yet persuaded the country that progressive change is the way to go. We haven't yet put together a proper programme to deliver that. So therefore it's up to you and me in this room, and others like us outside of this room, to show a new way forward for Britain. The alternative is the collapse of our country into a decade or possibly more of sterile decline. Today I want to talk about our political institutions and our so-called constitution, why they're failing and what we might do about it if we get a transformational government elected. Don't worry, though many of you may be Labour supporters, I'm not going to simply argue that we need to change our government to rule over the same failing system. Though I think we do need a new government, I'm sure you would expect me to say that, but there's much more to do than that. Now let's step back a moment and think about the bigger picture. And it's said that one of the great glories of our British Constitution is the fact that it's unwritten, that it's flexible, that it evolves in a gentle way over time, and that it's infinitely adaptable. All of that may be true. But its flexibility also means that the British establishment has often been able to bend political power in whatever direction it needs for its own purposes. And sometimes they've had to make concessions when there's been a rising tide of anger from below, when things are deteriorating in the country, but in more normal times, and also often actually in periods of great crisis, if you look through our history, you'll see that what the establishment does is to accrue further and further power to themselves, because the Constitution, the way we organise politics, allows precisely that process to happen. Okay, sometimes things surge away from the ruling class and their dominance becomes imperiled. But when that happens, the mask of civility and gentility which surrounds this myth of the British Constitution begins to slip away. And the old ways of doing things quickly get dropped. You can see that now. The normal rules have been torn up, haven't they? Let's just quickly remind ourselves. A Tory government, unsure it could command a majority in the House of Commons, then instructed its MPs to stop voting. Time after time, we won votes. with no votes against at all. And then they delegitimised those votes in the Commons and just ignored them. I mean, it's astonishing when you reflect on it, but it became normal, the new normal. In effect, they stopped legislating. When they came to the budget, there were certain clauses in the budget they could not deliver a majority for. They simply abandoned those clauses. Again, any finance bill in normal times which was voted down or which lost a vote would automatically lead to the collapse of the government. In this case, there was no consequence at all. And then they suffered the worst defeat in British parliamentary history, and for the first time ever, a British government lost a vote in the Commons itself, and yet they still carried on. And now we have seen two separate prime ministers introduced into the country with no election, unelected prime ministers, now suspending Parliament in order to avoid embarrassing or difficult votes. These are extraordinary times. And it reminds us this so-called gloriously flexible constitution can be used in ways which actually are very, very reactionary indeed. And so it's not the benign and incremental change to our politics which they've often talked about. It's rather what we've seen is a rapid and divisive twisting of the knife, which was inserted deep into the body politic in recent years. And we've reached the point because the establishment, unsure of where its interests now lie, divided between different fractions within the ruling class, rapidly losing consent amongst the wider population. And consent is the basic principle for the continuation of a liberal democracy. That ruling class, the British establishment, however you want to call it, feels threatened like never before. And it's clear that the new Prime Minister now sees himself as the best answer to the crisis. Johnson is trying to stand above democracy. He's seeking to sidestep Parliament and forcibly bind to himself a large part of the British establishment around his own personal leadership. These are dangerous times, new phenomena, certainly since the war. His promise to the establishment is that he alone is now capable of solving the crisis, and that he alone can save the ruling class from the prospect of a radical Labour government, giving expression to the feelings in the country of dissatisfaction and insurgent feelings which you can encounter everywhere, led by Jeremy Corbyn. And it's the fear of Corbyn which is forcing so many of them to go along with the Boris show, even though some of them may have a bad taste in their mouths. Read the columns of the Times, the Telegraph, even one or two columns in the Guardian, dare I say, for anybody who's a Guardianista in the room. All of this reminds me of Antonio Gramsci's description of Bonapartism. He says, Bonapartism represents the fusion of an entire social class under a single leadership, which alone is then held to be capable of solving the overriding problems which the ruling class faces and of fending off mortal danger. All of this we have to resist. And to make sure we defeat this resurgent right-wing populism, fulfill our ambition of securing social justice, we do need to change the way we do politics. So we need a democratic revolution, because if you're following my argument, the political and constitutional arrangements of our country have allowed this phenomenon to arise and have permitted this domination by a single class over the whole of society and over politics. And I'm going to go on to make that argument. Clearly, at this moment of great danger, we have to defend existing democratic institutions insofar as they retain democratic content against power grabs and backroom manoeuvres by an overmighty executive. Of course, that's what we must do. And there are demonstrations in many of the great cities of our country today, and we welcome them. But defending the status quo simply is not enough. So our understanding of what's happening now, at the present moment, needs to go deeper. And our actions need to be bolder, and our proposals need to form a coherent whole which offers a different way forward for the country. We're going to see what happens in the courts in the coming days, but the fact of the matter is that the current constitutional arrangements give extraordinary powers to a Prime Minister, monarchic powers. even an unelected Prime Minister, the one we've got at the moment, one whose majority is wafer thin in the Commons, and whose majority of one is based on a grubby £1 billion deal with the DUP. All of that would be unthinkable in so-called normal times. Just look at how effortlessly Johnson was able to suspend Parliament. And the idea that Prime Ministers, throughout our history until quite recently, were able to commit British troops to war without parliamentary approval just illustrates exactly some of the undemocratic parts of our so-called beloved constitution. Of course, there was a vote in the case of Iraq, a war which was designed to demonstrate the alignment between American and British elite interests. I voted against the war in Iraq. The point is this, that Parliament was lied to with the connivance of the British political class, the deep state, and most of the mass media. And then there was the crisis of the MP's expenses, the 2008 banking crash, the lies and the austerity which followed, and the Conservative Party's handling of Brexit. All of these contribute to a breakdown of public trust, a loss of consent, a collapse of consent in the country, and a breakdown of ruling class hegemony. There's a sense amongst many people that as a nation, many ordinary people, the people I represent, ex-mining communities in Yorkshire, there's a sense amongst many people up and down the country that as a nation we're hurtling towards an unknown destination at a breakneck speed, and we've no idea who's in charge of the direction of the train. Across the country, this feeling of lack of control, a society, a community, a neighbourhood with no sense of its own direction, sense of agency or power over people's lives, is breeding fear, resentment, and even anger. And ironically, for the majority of these people, these feelings about political failure and about politicians actually comes, from something quite remarkable, which is a deep-seated attachment by the people of Britain to the principles of democracy. Every poll will show how attached people are to the idea of democracy in our country. But the same polls then say, when you say to people, you believe in democracy, how democratic do you think this country really is? The answer is quite a lot less favourable. People know that the democracy has been eaten away if it ever truly existed. And who can blame people for coming to that conclusion? Democracy has a value in itself, but it's primarily judged on whether it can help to deliver a good government and, more importantly, a good life for ordinary people. By that measure, democracy's failed. The class divisions in our society now, I want to talk about social justice and its connection to democracy. The class divisions in our society are deeper than ever, back in many ways to Victorian levels of inequality. Between 2019 and 2018, the richest 1,000 people in our country increased their wealth by £466 billion. That's not what we're worth, that's just the increase in the value of the 1,000 people. £466 billion, while there are 33 million working people in our country who lost almost exactly the same amount of money from their income. And there you have it, a direct transfer of over £400 billion from 33 million working people to 1,000 of the 1,000 richest people in our country. Meanwhile, there are 4 million children in poverty, to our shame. 1 in 3 kids in the UK in poverty. What we've seen and what the political system has allowed to happen, austerity for the many, prosperity for the few. No wonder people are losing faith in democracy and in politics. Above all, we have to conclude that universal suffrage, the idea of equality, that every person has the same right to vote in the ballot box. The universal suffrage, on the one hand, has not delivered a classless society or social justice on the other. It's a stark differentiation between the equality of the ballot box and the inequality of the society. And so our political institutions are failing. And what the events of Peterloo, which after all we are commemorating, teach us, is that movements for political and constitutional reform throughout our whole history, more than 1,000 years, those movements for reform of politics arise when the economic and social conditions which the people experience become intolerable. That when men and women who gave their lives at Peterloo and gave their blood understood this, and we should too, here in Manchester, if you listen carefully, you'll hear the voices. You can read the words, see the banners, and visit the graves of the Peterloo martyrs. They demanded a proper democracy. What was their demand? It was transformation of the House of Commons, after all. Suffrage for all. They thought that democracy would free the country from poverty. That was the objective of all of these uprisings for political change. I found a few words from a letter written by a group of women at the time of Waterloo. Remember, at Peterloo, that women were demanding female suffrage at Peterloo. In a letter which they wrote to a local newspaper, the women wrote, "The day is near at hand when nothing will be found in our unhappy country but luxury, idleness, dissipation and tyranny on the one hand, and abject poverty, slavery, wretchedness and death on the other." So the movement for political reform emerged partly about the conditions of hardship, inequality and poverty which working class people were encountering. And to avert the evils of poverty and hardship and inequality, the women demanded reform of the House of Commons. So there you have it. In their minds, democracy would create a more equal country based on the principles of social justice 200 years ago. Think about it for a minute. If somehow those women who wrote that letter could be here today in Manchester, 200 years on, 100 years after universal suffrage, and they saw the poverty and injustice in Manchester, how they would feel. And it's hard not, by the way, to read accounts of what happened that day in Peterloo. This is a side comment, but let me just make it. What happened that day in Peterloo without recalling how the miners' strike was policed not so long ago. I saw it. I was there. I was part of that movement. Others in this room may have been too. The truth is we know more about Peterloo than we know about Orgreave. So there must be a proper independent inquiry into this matter. Labour will set one up as part of one of its first initiatives in office. But the central question we must ask ourselves today is whether or not we, our generation, has organised things in a way which honours the dead and the injured at Peterloo. Because they fought for us to have the suffrage. And the only honest answer we can give is no. Our generation has failed those martyrs. Our politics is broken. Our country is riven with conflict. As for social justice, forget it. Just forget it. As a consequence, we are now in a moment of profound crisis. You'd expect me to say this, member of the Shadow Cabinet, we obviously need a new government. And we need it urgently. But we need nothing less than a government which is determined to transform in fundamental ways the way in which we operate our politics and our broader society. Why should we accept the fact that 8 generations later, the great-great-great-grandchildren of the Peterloo martyrs should be living in poverty in Manchester today? And here's this, 63,500 children in Manchester in poverty today. What would those women feel about that level of child poverty? 48%, almost 1 in 2, I think it is. Every child in Manchester living in poverty. It's absolutely quite shocking. So let's be honest, the British state, its powers and constraints, who it serves and why, has proved itself incapable of tackling the problems which the country faces. It emerged in a different epoch and to fulfil different purposes. It still bears the imprint of the imperial past. When I look at the size of the Foreign Office, I think, well, they still think we're running the empire. I mean, you just wonder, you really do wonder about some of the structures over-centralised, remote, lacking any sensitivity to the new currents flowing through modern Britain, which would delight through our political and social life, but alienated and insensitive to those new currents. And when we think about the House of Lords, especially the farce of 92 hereditary peers, still in there now, it's not hard not to think that Parliament is more responsive to 1,000 years of privilege than it is to the concerns of most people today. Politics is not serving the interests of the whole electorate. It's being captured by the rich and powerful, the global corporations, the city boys and the spivs that we see on the televisions all the time. Look at the outsourcing industry. £1 in every 3 taxpayers' money in the private sector, a parasitic presence right in our midst. But outsourcing means that the services are no longer subject to parliamentary and democratic scrutiny. Profits made from hospital services, from schools, from caring for children, looking after our elderly. Where once there was an accountable public service ethos, there's now simply a get-rich-quick mentality. Tax avoidance, two-tier working conditions paid for by you and me. And then there's the explosion of commercial lobbying, lucrative second jobs for parliamentarians, the revolving door, the flood of dark and big money into our politics. All of these things leave Parliament weak and our democracy unable to function properly, its reach reduced, and our vote having less and less significance. And in the triangle of competing powers, I want to try to express a complicated idea. In Britain, where it's hard to know where sovereignty actually lies in our complicated constitution. Does sovereignty lie with the government? Does it lie with Parliament? Or does it lie, as it should, with the British people? It's impossible to disentangle that. But if by sovereignty we mean there is a central locus of power in 21st century, where does it lie? It's hard to argue that it lies with the people, with the executive, or with Parliament. The sovereignty of the people barely exists when compared to the strength of the executive and the privileged elite which controls the levers of power over the executive. We call it corporate capture. The idea that the state is being captured by big corporations and a wealthy elite. So bold actions required. Finally, let me just make a few points very quickly now to wind up, just to take us forward as to what I think we should be doing. I'm going to make several points. Firstly, in the short term, we need to tackle corporate and elite capture of the state. Secondly, we need to take seriously the long-term reform of our constitutional arrangements. Thirdly, we need to tackle gross wealth, privilege and power, which lies outside of all of the formal political structures in our constitution. So much power lies outside of politics. I, on behalf of the Labour Party and the Labour Party generally, have already begun to make proposals which will continue to unravel more policies intended to address each of these matters in the coming period. So let me just make a few quick points. I'm going to be making more speeches and statements as we get into the autumn, possibly in the run-up to a January election. We need to end outsourcing. Just let's be blunt about it. We need proper controls over the commercial lobbyists who walk through Whitehall and Westminster as though they were the kings of the realm. Commercial lobbyists. We need to overhaul all our political finance rules. We need to end the idea that money buys influence and power. Increase transparency and end the influence of dark money. We need strict regulations on the revolving door whereby members of the British establishment rotate between one privileged position and another. One day you're a general buying tanks, the next day you've retired and you're working for the tank company, selling the tanks to your mates who were the generals after you've left. That's the revolving door. That's what's happening. We need to end the old English principle of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Often calculated on the golf greens in the home counties of England. In my personal view, why on earth are MPs and parliamentarians allowed to have second jobs? All of those are good ideas, and we're going to do them. And it's in my mind to do them quick. So, first morning, if I'm lucky enough to have this job I've got now, when Jeremy becomes Prime Minister, if we can get him in there, change the procurement policy immediately that morning, end outsourcing. It'll take some time because quite a lot of contracts are already out there, but to get straight on with it. Why should the people who regulate the revolving door be just the British establishment, all sirs and ladies and lords and barons and so on? Do you know that there's a committee that's supposed to regulate this scratching your back business, revolving door? It's full of all these people. They've never refused anybody permission. Osborne went off, one day as a Chancellor of the Exchequer, next minute he's running a bloody bank. Not to mention the former leader of the Liberal Party who did something similar. So, but Labour politicians have done the same. So, but these are short-term, ameliorative fixes which we can do quickly. I'm trying to clean up politics. However, it seems to me, if we're going to actually change Britain for the good and forever, we do need to tackle fundamental constitutional reform. And that's why both in our 2015 and 2017 manifestos, I insisted that we got in there a commitment to a constitutional convention which will put into the hands of citizens the power to begin to debate how politics and our constitution should work in the future. This will be a dramatically radical and challenging process. For the first time in our history, it should be the people who get to decide how we do politics, not the ruling class. And some of the issues which the convention might handle. What about starting with the House of Lords? We said in our 2017 election manifesto that the Labour Party's fundamental belief is that the second chamber should be democratically elected. And what about devolution? Why should power remain in Whitehall, centralised in one of the most top-down states in the world? Why shouldn't the north of England have powers to decide its own future, or the southwest or the east of England? I personally believe in a Council of the North. There was a Council of the North hundreds of years ago. It met in my constituency, actually. And it used to, the power of the British state was based in part in the north of England. Why shouldn't we reverse the direction which we've got at the moment? And the other regions too. Radical federalism, alongside our friends, brothers and sisters, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, is, in my view, is the future. But the list of areas for constitutional reform, I could go on and on and on. Where was that? Reinvigorating local government, tackling archaic processes in the Commons, ending access of graduates from a handful of top universities to elite jobs, replacing it with more diversity. All of these are issues. There are other issues as well. Electoral reform is one, and there are many others too. But this must not be a top-down process, even though it's by Labour politicians who hopefully we can trust a bit more than the lot we've got at the moment. It needs to be from the bottom up, and therefore, I don't believe it's for me or for any senior politician to dictate how that constitutional convention does its work. And look, all of this implies a new constitutional settlement, putting sovereignty in the hands of the people, taking it from powerful elites. So much power and privilege stands outside of our political structures. All of this needs to be addressed too. So I've talked about immediate ameliorative measures. I've talked about big constitutional reform. I now want to just quickly say, we also need to address where power lies outside of the political structures. It's fine having a new electoral system, but if the billionaires continue to decide that work should be conducted in a particular way, that will not necessarily have the kind of transformational effect in the world of work that you would expect. I commissioned George Monbiot to work with me to pull together a new document, Land for the Many. You ought to read it. It is probably the single most radical document the party's produced, or has been produced in our country since Beveridge. It's a dramatically radical document. I commissioned it, George and his team wrote it, and it's talking about taking the land and using it for the many and not just for the few. We've talked about elected workers on boards and so on and so forth. So this whole process of democratising the rest of society is important too. Anything less, we fail to live up to the inspiring legacy, I'm finishing, of the Peterloo campaigners who matched their beliefs with a fierce courage which we need today. But let me finish with this thought then. It's not a task which should fall to me. It's not a task or a property which should belong to a single party either. It's a task for every one of us. There will always be, by the way, centralisers, authoritarians, sectarians, people who say they know better than the rest of us, powerful interests who will attempt to stop us. And there'll be many who say, well, the task is just too big, it's too difficult, and there are other priorities. If we really think that political reform, the democratisation of our society, and challenging the top-down nature of our country is an important task, then every one of us needs to build a movement which is unstoppable, because that's the only way you bring about change in the end. Let's take our inspiration from Henry Vincent, who spoke on behalf of the Chartist movement a few years after Peterloo. He said, when a nation arouses from its slumber and its people display signs of returning vitality, then the rulers of that nation are sure to take alarm. I think we need to do our radical ancestors proud. Let's see if we in this room and all of our colleagues, comrades, friends together can finish the job, which after all, they did get started over 200 years ago. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Jon. And I'd like to invite Emma to say some words.